Let's go through what happened just hours after officially becoming the 47th president of the United States. President Donald Trump set the tone for an aggressive first 100 days in office. NBC News Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander has more.
After a marathon day of inaugural festivities celebrating his return to the Oval Office, President Trump behind the resolute desk signing dozens of executive actions, starting with perhaps the most controversial.
So this is January 6th. These are the hostages. Approximately 1,500. Full pardon. What they've done to these people is outrageous.
Pardoning nearly all January 6th defendants, effectively ending the largest investigation in federal law enforcement history. On January 6th, more than 140 officers were injured and Capitol property destroyed. The president had teased his plans to pardon at least some of the defendants, including earlier at the inaugural parade after greeting relatives of Israelis and Americans taken hostage by Hamas.
I'm going to be signing on the J6 hostages pardons.
But it had not been clear that the action would include those convicted of violent offenses, including assaulting police, which some Republicans had argued against.
If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned.
Trump also commuting the sentences of individuals associated with far-right groups, the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, including its leader Enrique Tarrio, who had been serving 22 years in federal prison for seditious conspiracy. Supporters for those pardoned celebrating overnight. President Trump also responding to the day's other pardon announcements. In the last hours of his presidency, Joe Biden preemptively pardoning the members of the committee that investigated January 6th, including former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, along with Dr. Anthony Fauci and General Mark Milley. None has been convicted of any crime. Biden also later pardoning members of his own family.
I was a little bit surprised that he did it, because it makes him look guilty.
Trump also signing a barrage of executive orders, including declaring a national emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border and attempting to end birthright citizenship in some circumstances, a right that's guaranteed by the Constitution.
Good. That's a good one.
The inauguration day had started with unity between Trump and Biden, before Trump took his oath inside the Capitol due to frigid temperatures.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
In his inaugural address, Trump delivering this searing critique of his predecessor without ever mentioning him by name.
My recent election is a mandate to completely and totally reverse a horrible betrayal. From this moment on, America's decline is over.
The traditional parade also moved inside, the president celebrating in front of a massive crowd of MAGA faithful in downtown D.C.
You're witnessing the dawn of the golden age of America.
All right. In addition to J.D. Vance, many Republicans in the past said that January 6th rioters should not be pardoned. Take a look.
The folks that were part of the riots and frankly, the assault on the U.S. Capitol have to be held accountable. There is a rule of law.
They shouldn't be pardoned.
Of course not. Oh, my goodness, no.
I do not think the President Trump should have made that pledge to do pardons. We should let the judicial process proceed.
I don't want to reinforce that defiling the Capitol was okay. I don't want to do anything that would make this more likely in the future. I want to deter people who did on January the 6th, and those who did it, I hope they go to jail and get the book thrown at them because they deserve it.
Americans will always have the freedom of speech and the constitutional right to protest, but violence in any form is absolutely unacceptable. It is anti-American and must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
I saw Capitol Police officers bleeding, bruised, and I saw damage to a certain extent as we were exiting. To call those people patriots is not in my lexicon.
So, Jonathan, let me hear, how many of those Republicans that have been speaking out said, oh, my goodness, no, we should never pardon those that beat the hell out of cops? How many of those do we expect to hear come out today and and repeat what they've said before.
It was a cliche in the first Trump term where he would do something or tweet something. Reporters would take it to the Hill, ask Republican lawmakers for comment, and they're always like, well, I didn't see the tweet. I didn't see it. I can't weigh in. I suspect we're going to have some lawmakers claiming they didn't see the executive order or the acts of clemency last night, or at least I need to review the details and get the specifics. It is difficult. Joe, we talked about this at the beginning of the show. It is, if past this prologue, it's difficult to imagine too many Republicans standing up to Donald Trump and saying, no, this is wrong. There might be a few. We have known there have been moments of courage. Senator Murkowski, as an example. There's certainly former Senator Romney. Maybe we just saw Susan Collins. Maybe she will. But that should not be expected to be a widespread phenomenon. Although, again, as we can't play this footage enough, there are so many Republicans, dozens upon dozens, saying those who committed violent acts should not be pardoned. Even the Trump team had signaled for some weeks that they likely wouldn't pardon those, that it would rather be a little more limited in what the president would do. But last night, it's everyone. It's Oath Keepers, it's Proud Boys, it's those. I was just reading a moment ago about an individual who put his cell phone in his mouth, one of these rioters, so we could have both hands to beat on the cop in front of him, including taking the police officer's baton and bashing him. He was sentenced to, over 4 years in prison. That person now going to be set free because of what Donald Trump did.
There was ISO footage on this network last night of the guy who came out early in the day yesterday and said that he had heard, a convict, who said that he had heard that he was going to be pardoned later. And they had isolated footage of him from January 6th. Where he was beating a cop with a baseball bat. They said, this is the guy right here hitting these cops with this black Louisville Slugger. That guy now free.
Enrique Tarrio, the head of the Proud Boys, now.
Let me read some Republican quotes while this video's going. Kristi Noem, we are all entitled to peacefully protest. Violence is not part of that. What is happening in the Capitol right now must stop. Ted Cruz, in 22, a violent terrorist attack on the Capitol where we saw the men and women of law enforcement risk their lives to defend the men and women who serve in this Capitol. Rick Scott, everyone has a right to peacefully protest. No one has a right to commit violence. What happened at the Capitol is disgraceful and un-American. It is not what our country stands for. Tim Scott, the violence occurring at the United States Capitol is simply unacceptable. I fully condemn it. Marsha Blackburn, these actions at the United States Capitol are truly despicable and unacceptable. Marsha Blackburn. While I am safe and sheltering in place, these protests are prohibiting us from doing our constitutional duty. I condemn them in the strongest terms. We are a nation of laws. Tom Tillis said that calling people convicted of January 6 crimes hostages are political prisoners. Quote, that's like calling drug traffickers unlicensed pharmacists. At the end of the day, they're J6 convicts to me. Marco Rubio, there is nothing patriotic about what occurred on Capitol Hill. This is third world style anti-American anarchy. Ron DeSantis, violence or rioting of any kind is unacceptable, and the perpetrators must face the full weight of the law. Tom Emmer, the majority whip of the House of Representatives, those responsible for the violence must continue to be held accountable. And it just goes on and on. John Cornyn, somebody who's been duly convicted of a federal crime, is not a hostage. I'm a big believer in our criminal justice system, and I believe that people are presumed to be innocent until they are proven guilty. But once they are, I accept that verdict and I accept that judgment. Senator Mike Rounds, I view them as the same individual the juries that convicted them. There was violence on that day. The people violated the law. There were people that tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power after the election. I do not agree with anybody that says they are political prisoners. And that's just a handful, Simone, of a lot of Republicans who, through the years, and we heard what Lindsey said, we heard what they've all said about. And by the way, the Republicans feared for their lives that day as much as the Democrats. It's the Republicans that were running and sheltering in place as much as the Democrats. Their lives were at risk that day as much as the Democrats.
The people who entered the Capitol this day intent on harming police officers and potentially members of Congress. Like, there's this iconic video of former Senator Mitt Romney being redirected away from the mob. Can you think of what would have happened if the mob saw Senator Romney? They were searching through the Capitol looking for Nancy Pelosi, saying, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Last night, after this happened, one of our producers from The Weekend, Evan, he reminded me that in 2020, Donald Trump signed an executive order after the summer of protests, specifically around racial justice, and it affirmed 10-year prison sentences for the destruction of federal property. And this is what he wrote in the order. He said, "My administration will not allow violent mobs incited by a radical fringe to become the arbiters of the aspects of our history that can be celebrated in public spaces." As of April 2022, I believe federal authorities say about $2.73 million in federal property damages happened on January 6th.
Right.
It's just, it's first of all, he has been saying this, as you all said. He said he was going to do this. So for everyone that said, "Oh, it's just rhetoric. Oh, he didn't really mean it. Oh, it'll be measured." It's not just rhetoric. Donald Trump is actually I heard Donnie Deutsch earlier saying he's a master marketer. He's very clear and specific.
Right.
You know, he's very clear and specific.
And to the cheer of the crowd.
And to the cheer of the crowd. He doesn't need anyone to translate his thoughts for him. He's telling us, the president is very clear about what it is he thinks, what it is he believes, and I think it's high time that everybody starts taking him at his word.
That's what we said during the campaign. David wrote... go ahead.
No, you go.
Your take on this is this may not have been in President Trump's best interest. Donald Trump seemed to be enjoying this and getting the crowd kind of fired up, and he had the Israeli hostage and hostage families behind him when he was talking about this, and then, of course, did it later in the day back at the White House. What's your take?
It's Jonathan, that there's other versions of this. He could have pardoned, there was like 700 nonviolent offenders and just on that group. And so he instead went for the maximum amount, basically everyone, and this defines his inaugural day. What are we talking about this morning? January 6th. The Republicans want to be talking about January 6th. And then from a national security perspective, the Proud Boys is a very serious signal. The Oath Keepers is another group. Both groups were convicted by a jury of their peers of seditious conspiracy. And remember, again, he won the election. It is President Trump's decision. He is in office now.
Yeah.
But he chose in the debate with Biden to say to the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. And if, from a law enforcement perspective, if you have a political leader talking about an armed militia group that is hearing that signal, now they've all been freed from prison. That is very, very concerning.